Hi, I'm Lindsay, also known as Artist Warrior, and welcome to my second ever YouTube video and my first painting process video. My first video was about painting a mural at a school in Uganda, but this time I'm taking you through the process of creating one of my acrylic paintings. This piece is called Living Water. It's an 11 by 14 inch painting and it revisits an idea that I first explored in a previous commission piece. I recorded as much of the process as I could, and I've deliberately only shown close-up sections as I worked, so you won't see the full finished painting until the very end. So let's get started. Okay, so the idea for this painting actually began with a previous commission piece. As I said, the person who commissioned me had simply asked me to create a painting, so the concept itself was my own: a kingfisher, hands, water, and the sense of something being brought to life. I really loved that idea and I wanted to return to it, but not simply recreate the original painting. I wanted to develop it into a completely new piece, using my own Kingfisher photography and adding more depth and symbolism beneath the surface. The original commission painting was landscape, but for this piece I was working on an 11 by 14 inch portrait panel. That meant I needed to completely rethink the composition and work out how to fit all of the different elements into a much smaller, narrower space. The kingfisher in this painting is based on one of my own wildlife photographs. I love photographing kingfishers, and I particularly like this moment because the bird is bursting up through the water with so much movement and energy. The hands are also my own. I took several photographs of them before I managed to get the position that I wanted. I needed them to look as though they were underneath the water, open and reaching upwards into the centre of the painting. The only reference images that weren't my own were the jellyfish, which I found through Canva. Once I'd gathered all of my references, I began building the composition in Canva. This helped me to experiment with the position and size of each element before committing anything to the actual canvas. I knew I wanted the kingfisher to be bursting through the surface of the water, with the hands below it and the jellyfish surrounding them in murky depths. An important part of the idea was that the part of the kingfisher still beneath the surface would be painted in black and white. As it breaks through the water, it begins to gain colour, becoming bright and vivid above the surface. Once I was happy with the rough composition, I created the sketch in Procreate on my iPad. I then used an app called DocuSlice to get the design to the correct size and create a print-ready PDF with cut marks. That meant I could print the image across several pages, piece it together and transfer it accurately onto the 11 by 14 inch panel. I used carbon paper to transfer the image onto the canvas, which gave me the main outlines ready to begin painting. At the beginning of the process, I was working at an easel. Later on, I ended up moving rooms and using a drawing table instead, which actually made it much easier when I reached some of the more detailed areas. I began by working on the background and the underwater atmosphere. I wanted the lower section of the painting to feel deep, murky and shadowed. It needed to be dark, but not completely flat, so I built up subtle areas of green and black to create the feeling of being beneath the surface. Above the water, I wanted there to be more light coming through, as though the bird was breaking out into a different space. The painting has quite a strong divide running through it, darkness below the surface and colour and life emerging above it. But I also wanted all of those parts to feel connected rather than completely separate. The jellyfish sit in the darkest part of the painting. At first glance, they might just seem like underwater details, but for me they became something more than that. They're almost trying to pull the kingfisher back into the murky depths. I wanted them to feel shadowy and slightly unsettling, drifting beneath the surface while the bird is struggling upwards into the light. They represent the things that can hold us down, keep us trapped, or try to drag us back into the darkness even when we're beginning to break free. Because they're underneath the water, I kept them much more muted than the kingfisher. They're there surrounding the hands and the lower part of the bird, but they're not meant to be the most powerful part of the image. The hands were one of the most important elements for me because they sit right at the centre of the underwater part of the painting. I painted them in deep purple tones, keeping them connected to the darker atmosphere below the surface. As the painting developed, I wanted light to begin within the hands and travel outwards from them. I didn't want it to look like random lines simply painted over the top. I wanted it to feel as though the light was coming from within, like glowing veins, roots or branches spreading through the darkness. At this stage, I was still building up the shapes and shadows in the hands before adding the brighter areas later on. The water was one of the most challenging parts of the painting because it runs straight across the middle and connects everything together. I wanted it to feel active and turbulent, as though the Kingfisher had just burst through the surface and disturbed the whole scene. I gradually built up the splash with layers of green, yellow and lighter highlights, trying to capture the movement of the water as it rises around the bird. The bubbles were added throughout the painting, both above and below the surface. They helped make the underwater section feel alive, but they also carry our eye upwards through the image towards the Kingfisher. Adding the brighter highlights made a big difference. Once the white and pale yellow details were added, the water began to catch the light and feel much more energetic. It was one of those sections that needed a lot of patience because all of the little marks and tiny bubbles slowly worked together to create the final effect. The Kingfisher was probably the part I was most excited to paint because it came from one of my own photographs. Kingfishers are such small birds, but they have an incredible intensity of colour. That vivid blue and orange feels even more striking when you see one suddenly bursting out of the water. In this painting, the waterline is also the point where the bird begins to change. The section of the Kingfisher that remains beneath the surface is painted in black and white. It's still recognisable as the bird, but it's not yet gained the colour and life of the part above the water. As the Kingfisher breaks through the surface, the blue and orange feathers begin to appear. I wanted it to feel as though life and colour are returning as it emerges from the depths. I gradually layered up the feathers, building in the blue along the wings and head, and the warmer orange tones through the body. Painting the feathers was one of the most enjoyable parts of the process. I wanted to capture some of the realism of the bird while still allowing it to sit naturally within the more symbolic world of the painting. The Kingfisher also has an extra layer of meaning for me because it connects with the biblical image of becoming fishers of people. It felt like the right subject for a painting about life, rescue, and living water. The light is really at the heart of this painting. I wanted it to feel organic and alive rather than controlled or neatly designed. It spreads through the hands like roots, branches or veins, growing upwards through the water and towards the bird. This light is what gives life to the scene. It begins below the surface in the darkest part of the painting and reaches upwards through the hands. It connects with the movement of the water and with the kingfisher as it breaks through into colour. The light eventually reaches all the way to the kingfisher, culminating in a crown-like halo of light around its head. I wanted this to feel subtle rather than literal, but it helps emphasise the transformation taking place. The bird isn't only gaining colour as it rises from the water, it's also being surrounded by light. For me, this crown of light represents the life, identity and glory that come from God. As the bird rises out of the darkness below, it's not only restored to colour but also surrounded by divine light. It became a visual reminder that the source of life in the painting isn't the bird itself, but God working through the whole scene. The jellyfish are still there in the depths, almost trying to pull the bird back down, but the light is stronger. The bird is still rising, the colour is still appearing, the water is still moving. For me, that's what living water is about. The life and light that come from God. Even in dark places, it's about being drawn out of the darkness and into life, while the things that once tried to keep hold of us begin to lose their power. As I began to add the brighter light through the hands, this was the point where all of the different parts of the painting finally started to come together. The bird, the water, the hands, and the underwater world no longer felt like separate elements. The light connected them all. Towards the end of the painting, I spent time going back over the different areas and refining the details. I added more definition to the water splash, strengthened the highlights on the bubbles, adjusted the contrast in the feathers, and worked on making the light look as though it was really glowing through the hands rather than sitting on top of them. The final stages of any painting can be difficult because there's always the temptation to keep changing things, but eventually I reached a point where the image felt complete. This painting began with an idea I had already explored once before, but it became something entirely new. Using my own Kingfisher photograph, changing the composition, and developing the meaning beneath the water gave this piece its own identity. And although you've seen lots of small sections coming together throughout this video, I have deliberately kept the whole painting hidden until now. So, after all the planning, sketching, transferring, painting, problem solving, and layers of detail, here is the finished piece. This is living water. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the process behind the painting and watching all of the different sections slowly come together. As this is my first painting process video, I would love to know what you think and whether you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.